Hi everyone, and welcome students and colleagues. This is week 5 of Advertising Capstone Challenge Virtual Cafe. So thank you for joining us today. Don't forget this will be recorded and available in our special online restricted portal. We're very lucky this week to have Zara Cooper speaking from BWM Dentsu from their Melbourne offices, which we were just talking before. They're some of the funkiest offices there are, very industrial.
That's true.
And in a very trendy part of Melbourne. And I think that's an upside down John joining us there on a mobile phone. Is that you in a car, John? Not yet. Yeah. That's our colleague from Western Sydney Uni. So today we're going to be talking about digging for the key insight. And as all of you know, certainly students up and down the country, digging for the key insight is a pivotal phase in advertising research / planning, and that transition to developing the creative brief. And I think it's an incredibly exciting phase. And given our client this year, because we've got a motor vehicle manufacturers, I think I told you, Zara, we've got Suzuki Australia, who are not the market leader. But so that, the students have got a big challenge ahead of them this semester. So look, it's exciting to have you on board, and essentially I'm just going to hand over you for the rest of the session, and then we'll open up for Q&A at the end, depending how many students are available. So thank you.
No, thank you. Cool. So as mentioned, this is around digging for the key insight. Oh, it's not letting me go to the next. Oh, there we go. So just a little bit of background, because some of these things will have inevitably helped shape me and this presentation. So this consumer being me, just some top line demographics. I just turned 30 in lockdown, metro living, single income, no kids, which is that little sync. Female, she, her, and then getting onto my work experience. So I did actually have a stint in media buying to start, but that wasn't for me. I dipped out of that pretty quick. I then started at Clemenger BBDO here in Melbourne, and I was lucky enough to work on the Mars account, which was a really fun account to work on, Mars Chocolate, that is. And within that role, I kind of realized all the time that I ended up chatting to the planners and hanging around too long and getting in trouble for doing too much of that. And so I luckily had a planner kind of take me under his wing and direct me to a place called The Lab, which is insight and strategy. So there's no clear route to planning, unfortunately, but what you can get from sort of a research and strategy place like The Lab is really valuable. So that's where I went next, kind of in mind that I might end up in planning, but also open to the, opportunity of potentially staying there. Worked there for a couple of years, and then, sorry, I'm going backwards on this row. And then I actually took a bit of a career break and went traveling for 6 months without any job to come back to. So I was very lucky when I got back and saw a job going at BWM as a planner. So I got the job there, where I currently work on predominantly Toyota. The Paralympics was one of my clients until the Olympics and the Paralympics kind of were put on hold. And I also work on L'Oreal as of recently, L'Oreal Paris. Interests for me, we'll get to kind of why these might matter, but interests would be film and TV. I'm probably more nerdy than most on that. Succession is there because it's my favorite show this year. The Moth, so it's just podcasts I like listening to, and normally storytelling podcasts, which I actually heard in a talk recently, can be really helpful if you want to work in comms, especially things like planning and advertising. Just listening to the way people tell stories is quite interesting, and I was pretty happy to hear that, given that I already do that. Modern Love, The Moth, This American Life, that kind of thing. I like fine art, when I can, I do some, but pretty rarely, to be honest. And then finally, when it's possible and I'm not locked down by the government, I like to go to pub and drink with my friends, is mainly what I do in my spare time. So what's an insight? There's some stuff that I'll cover off here that might seem really, really basic, but I think it's important in terms of structuring your thinking and why things are important and how they all fit together. So an insight. So a definition by Mark Pollard, who is a really great sort of leading planner. He's Australian, but he lives in New York. He's got a podcast called Sweathead. I would highly advise listening to that if you don't already. So he defines it as an unspoken truth that sheds new light on the problem. It's also defined as an unrecognized fundamental human truth, normally written as attention. So there are 4 types, generally speaking. There's others, but there are 4 types of sort of key insights. There's cultural insights, consumer insights, product insights, and category insights. Generally speaking, consumer insights are the most useful or the most sort of important, but not always. So yeah, often when you kind of look into insights and the way they're spoken about, they'll talk about understanding the observation plus the why. That's kind of assuming that it's a consumer insight. So yeah, a lot of them will be consumer, but there are insights in those other spaces for sure. So thing with insights is, I think the only way to really understand what an insight is to just see lots of examples of them. These are 100% stolen. I did not write these, but just, yeah, a few examples. So as part of the decline in attendance of religious services, people are looking to other communities for ritual, meaning, and community. So that was one for someone who was writing a brief around sort of sports and F45 and that kind of thing. Those kind of really cult-like gyms and physical practices. Extroverts talk to think and introverts think to talk. I felt really seen when I read that one as an extrovert who talks out loud a lot. In a world where kids will pass out from playing marathon sessions of Fortnite, or people will binge watch Ozark in one night, our attention spans aren't shrinking, only our tolerance for boring. Dogs are good for people because their innocence helps us reconnect with our own. Having worked on Mars, I didn't directly work on Mars Pet, but that's definitely the space that pedigree sort of plays in. The irreplaceable part of a car is its story. So that one's kind of thinking about motor enthusiasts and the way they see cars. And having worked on cars now for a while, I think that's really true. There's so much in the sort of origin story of cars and what that means to consumers, especially when they get into the sort of high performance space. When one door of happiness closes, another one opens, but often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened before us. So that one's a bit deep. I think that's actually Helen Keller or something. But yeah, insights come from everywhere, and there's no one way. I did try to find it to define them more than what the definitions are that I had earlier. But yeah, it's just looking at them, playing around with them. It's kind of something that makes you go, huh? And it's sort of a take on the world that once it's there, it kind of feels like, of course, but yeah, actually getting there is the journey that we'll sort of go through in a bit. So I'm going to start off with a couple of case studies actually. So these are 2 that I have worked on at BWM. As mentioned, I work on Toyota, so they are Toyota. I just wanted to make a point quickly that not all the circles that you'll see on the page are always insights, so to speak. They might be an edge. So it might be a competitive edge of the product or the company, but there will be one insight in there. But it's just to say that it's kind of the combination of those things plus the insight that often leads you to your sort of territory or creative platform that then the creatives will then go and ideate off. So the first one. So Toyota CHR. I don't know if you've seen this car before, but it is a Toyota, but it looks pretty different to most Toyotas. So it came into the market a few years ago now, and when it did, and it still kind of is, a leap forward for tech, design, and the environment. So it's the first hybrid in its category. The tech was quite leading when it was introduced, and yeah, it's sort of just the design quite clearly. Well, if you know Toyotas, it doesn't really look like a Toyota. It looks very sort of modern and new and sort of, yeah, fresh in a way that a lot of Toyotas don't.
Yeah, you're right. It's a nice design, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of Toyotas are very sort of classic and sort of smooth lines, whereas this is, yeah, just much more angular and different to what they'd done before. So at the same time, that's Akio Toyoda, the CEO. Fun fact, Toyota, it's the Toyota with a D is the family name, but they changed it to Toyota just so that consumers could say it easier. So Akio Toyoda said, no more boring cars. So Toyota's famous for their reliability. They often talk about quality, durability, reliability. That's what they're famous for. That's what they're known for. But a lot of other car brands are catching up in terms of those attributes. So they have to, you know, sort of level up to the Mazdas of the world, to the other brands that are known for their style and their design aesthetically. So yeah, its reliability doesn't have to mean dull. It's kind of the thought there. And then finally, the consumers. So for Toyota CHR, they're looking to capture consumers in the sort of late 20s to mid 30s. And the type of people wanting to buy a Toyota, there is that sort of reliability there, and they're kind of moving up to that next stage in life, which might be a dog that needs to be carted around in the car. It might be potentially a kid coming along soon. But it's sort of those people that are ready to take the next step, but they're not keen on settling down and just feeling like everyone else. So it's kind of that fear of coming the sort of suburban person who's boring and just like everyone else and keeping up with, you know, next door. They want to do that. They want to be in that life stage, but they kind of don't want to acknowledge or don't want to be just like everyone else and do the boring way of doing that life stage. So those things coming together essentially brought out a platform that would lead to Toyota CHR change the rules. So yeah, if that makes sense. So if you look back at company, no more boring cars, it's a line in the sand moment for Toyota. For the car, it's a leap forward for tech design and the environment. And for the consumer, they're ready to move up, but they don't want to do what everyone else is doing. So changing the rules of what they're doing, what the car is doing, what the company is doing, that's where it all sort of laddered to.
Yeah, it's great design in the first place, isn't it? I mean, that car is a very strong design.
Yes.
So it's a beautiful product.
Totally. Yeah, we had, that's, you're right to point that out. Sometimes you get a brief and there's not too much, you know, it feels like you're bashing your head against the wall trying to come up with what is the competitive advantage, what is the hook, what is the different. But sometimes you're handed a gift where, you know what, this car would probably sell itself pretty well anyway. But coming up with sort of thought that makes it meaningful and makes it connect to the consumers is still key. But yeah, you're right. Sometimes it is easier to get there. So the next one was just a social campaign that we did this year, or the end of last year, came out this year. So it's for Toyota Genuine Parts. So a different element of the business that you guys, I'm not sure if you probably think about too often, is Toyota, on top of having the cars and their retail ads, they also have genuine parts and accessories, and they also have Toyota Finance, they also have Toyota Servicing. So there are all these elements that are very, very important to the business that require a lot of thought as well. So Toyota Genuine Parts, so this is just from their website, but by servicing and repairing your Toyota with genuine parts, you can be certain of quality, durability, and reliability, that QDR that I actually mentioned earlier. So the category of sort of parts here, being both non-genuine parts and genuine parts. So the category is a mixed bag. So non-genuine parts can work fine. They could be just as, Toyota probably won't be saying this, but they can probably work really, really well, but they can also be of absolutely any quality. So I've actually talked to people who work in this space at Toyota, and it's true that if you get non-genuine parts, they can literally be filled with cardboard fillings, random stuff that just obviously brings down the cost of manufacturing, but then you're lumped with this part that's really not good. But as someone going to it, how would you know? Company. So Toyota, I don't mean to brag too much about Toyota, but is the most trusted car company in Australia. It wins most trusted car company every year, probably for the last like 9 years now. And it also is the only car brand to kind of come into the top 10 lists of brands generally that people trust in Australia. So it's, you know, at the moment, Aldi is really near the top of the list, other brands in different sectors, but Toyota is the only one to get into that space. So it's quite a nice space to be in when you're sort of talking around trust, because they are the most trusted and they can really own that more than actually any other car company in Australia at the moment. So finally, sorry about the terrible photo, but the consumer. So people buy generic to avoid a short-term cost. At the time, buying generic parts is a lot cheaper a lot of the time than buying Toyota parts. Not always, but a lot of the time there's quite a difference. But they are potentially creating a much bigger cost long-term. So if you put that part in your car, obviously that has cardboard fillings, and in a year your car breaks down, there's otherwise a new car, you're going to be lumped with a much bigger bill than what you would have if you had just spent an extra, you know, $60 on the Toyota genuine part, or even $100 if your car completely breaks down. So coming off that kind of grouping of thoughts and insight is this spot that they produced. Hopefully video works, but we'll see.
If it's not a Toyota genuine part, it could be from anywhere. Insist on Toyota genuine parts. Oh, what a feeling. Toyota.
So as you might have seen at the end of the ad, the sort of piece of equipment looks really similar to the flute. So they had a series of 3 ads that sort of played to that same thought of, if it's not genuine, it could be from anyone, it could be from anywhere. So yeah, a clever way of kind of looking at that Toyota trust and how important it is for your car. That's potentially your most valuable asset that you own, if not second to your house. So yeah, just kind of reinforcing that trust that, yeah, Toyota can own more than anyone, with that kind of uncertainty in what is a really kind of potentially dangerous category.
And using comedy as well. That's, you know, it's an appealing consumer to the consumer, isn't it? You know, comedy does well. So
and yeah. Toyota really tries to keep to a pretty specific Toyota tone. They're never going to do a sort of Skittles completely the ad. But they do always want to have sort of a little bit of a smile on the sort of viewer's face, because, yeah, you know, humor is really powerful. And if you want to not annoy the viewers who are sitting through their 7th ad, that ad break, it's always a good idea to make the ad.
And that's a really interesting point, actually, saturation, you know, or the fact that, you know, the ad breaks so long. So I think that's an appealing campaign, what you've got. I think it's very clever.
Yeah, it's fun. They did a really good job.
Yeah, and yeah, fun. You got it. Fun.
Awesome. So how do you get there? So now I'll take you through a bit of the ways I see in which, yeah, and again, preface with, I'm one planner. I did talk to my colleagues about this, so you've got a couple of planners' brains on it, but this is kind of the way I sort of see it as shaping out generally. So a quick point on brief writing. The digging, this is pretty, yeah, and it's not meant to be a joke on the point of the iceberg, but the digging is kind of the massive part under the water that takes a lot of time to do, and it should take you a lot longer than writing the actual brief. Although you need to finesse the writing and make sure it's written in a way that will sort of excite the creative team, there's no good writing the brief really slowly, and really particularly if the information on it isn't interesting and true and worthwhile for the client. So you've been handed a client brief. Someone wants to sell something to someone. This is an obvious point, but in order to connect with consumers and stand a chance of cutting through, you need to stand out from the competitors and all the similar products that have been communicated before yours. It's an obvious point, but in 2020, when we're not in lockdown, we're thrown so many ads every day, you know, on the side of the road, on trams, on our phone, everywhere. If you want to cut through, especially in a sea of products that are probably quite similar to the one that you're advertising, you need to think of a new way to cut through. So a very top line journey with a couple of asterisks, which I will get to later. So interrogate the client brief with the client, look into the product category and purchase journey, unpack relevant cultural observations, understand your consumer, write the creative brief. So first things first, get as much information from the client as possible. In order to solve the real problem, you must first understand what it is. So when you're handed a client brief, which is quite different from the creative brief that you'll end up writing, when you're handed that client brief, their objective will normally be quite clear in terms of what they want to do. But they often might have mentioned a challenge or two, but often it's your job to work out what the real problem is. And that takes a lot of questions back and forth. Once you've worked out the problem, then you need to find a solution as the answer to then create the ad. So the insight, that unspoken truth that sheds new light on the problem, is the unlocking to the solution. Unlocks the solution to that problem. So a good insight will help you shed new light and fix that problem so you can get to an answer, so you can get to comms that feel new with an interesting and competitive edge. So it also makes sense that the insight, which is normally written as attention, to get to the fresh solution, it's sort of that solution will answer that tension that you've created in the ad or the thought that's in the piece of comms. So you're providing consumers with a solution to that tension that you've kind of reminded them that they have. Cool. So some areas to dig into with a client. So what you're trying to work out is what is stopping or what might stop the client from achieving their objective. So the category and product, something. So just a point, the clients are going to know this way better than you are. They're going to have access to information that you don't. Your job is to make sense of that information and make it into a meaningful issue and solution. But it's really, really worth interrogating the client brief with them at the start. So existing positioning and guardrails. So what might that existing positioning be? For L'Oreal, it's because you're worth it, for example. And everything you create needs to kind of ladder back up to that thought in some way. They'll also have things that you can and can't touch. Well, not always, but most of the time. A competitive set, who is winning and why. So who are they sort of looking over their shoulder at, jealous of, or, you know, why are they doing that? Product and category history, obvious, but really get that information from them. Again, they live and breathe this stuff. Some clients that I've worked with have worked in a Toyota for 20 years. They will understand it better than you will. So it's really worth getting their thoughts on it. Where do they believe growth is going to come from in their business? So that can be really, really handy to know where they think the sort of levers are. It can also help shine a light on maybe some of their biases, which you need to know and kind of interrogate. And then finally, and potentially most importantly, the competitive advantage, the key selling point or the unique selling point of the product that they want you to help them sell. Consumer, what you want to learn from them as well. So basic demographics. This can be hard to get from them even sometimes, but age, gender, metro living or not, socioeconomic group, attitudes and behaviors, why this target, is it definitely this target, could there be a more specific target? And this might be something that you work out yourself as you're going through. Sometimes it's frustrating to be handed a brief when it's just everyone in Australia, but at the same time, it can give you, depending on your client, but it can give you really nice license to come back and be really creative in finding a target that you think makes the most sense for that, or narrowing it down in your own very sort of reasoned way.
Can I just ask you a question, Zara? Because I'm really interesting, because we actually had a Q&A with the client yesterday. So the students have had a month to get to the session yesterday, but it was interesting because they did the reverse. They actually gave a specific target at the very start of the challenge. Yeah. And then yesterday they said, everyone.
I love that. Yeah, that does happen.
So I thought, yeah, just thinking what you were just saying, I thought that was hilarious.
If you can sell it to everyone, you'll get more buyers. So that's
that's what I got the sense that they just wanted more sales. But I thought, but it was also like, to me that sounds like desperation. But yeah. I just thought it was just on what you were saying. Sorry, I just thought.
No. But yeah, no, it's definitely worth sort of interrogating why they think, even if they might be wrong, it's worth interrogating why they think that target's their target, because it will also, all these things like give you clues, and they also really help in crossing off what the problem is. So you can kind of work that out, like, oh, do you have an existing positioning or whatever? And it's like, no. And you're like, well, that's problematic, or you know what I mean? But if they do and it's really strong, then you kind of, it's kind of a checklist of things that might be the problem and might not be. And this is also stuff you have to work out on your own, but just to mention that all these things and having that really good discussion with the client up front can be super helpful. I've got some little icons in the corner kind of talking to which areas these might be addressing. So firstly, immerse yourself amongst the competitive set and the buying occasion. So you're not all in lockdown, but I am. So at the moment, one of the few categories I could probably do this in would be if I was working on FMCG products, because I can go to the supermarket still or the chemist, but with the exception of those, I probably couldn't go to, if I was working on Country Road or, that kind of thing, I couldn't go into the store and sort of see what that journey looks like, but in normal times you can. Sometimes on certain products you won't be able to because they're just out of reach or super niche or super difficult. So what you're doing when you're kind of doing that. So start unpacking the rules of the category. So what are the competitors saying? How are they saying it? And who do you think they might be saying it to? So this is where you kind of start to work out what are the sort of tired cliches, what should we avoid? That said, there's sometimes some really clear rules to play, like you have to do this or that to be considered in the category. Otherwise, you won't succeed. You can kind of see it in FMCG. Like there are certain food cues and stuff that you would never do, and it's just quite obvious when you start looking at them. Understand the purchase process. So what kind of environment does your product exist in? So yeah, if you're working on cars, it would be the showroom, for example. But that said, it's also when you're sat behind a car at the traffic lights, when you're on your walks and seeing nice cars. There's so many cues for buying a car that aren't actually at the showroom. It normally comes before that. So what is the purchase journey? So to that point, from start to finish, you might need help from consumers. So if it is something as simple as a supermarket visit, you can probably work that out. But that said, once you've kind of got your research hat on, you can kind of miss some key things coming at from that angle. So sometimes it's probably getting my research background hat on, but it can be worth asking someone if they could explain what they think their journey is to you. And sometimes that will even be telling if they leave something key out, if you can follow them while they do it, asking their permission, of course. That can also be extremely useful. But then finally, recognize that the purchase decision and place of purchase aren't always the same. So that point to the point of cars, you don't decide you want to buy a car because you happen to rock up at a dealership in the same way that you would buy a random new biscuit at the supermarket just because you see it and the packaging is nice. So yeah, really working out what that process looks like and if there are any clues in it is also really useful. That said, I just want to stress the point that there are some people whose entire jobs are this, doing the sort of mapping. So you're never going to hit, you don't need to throw it into super duper detail, but understanding parts of it and the general gist of it and any key barriers that are kind of evident, it can be really, really useful and can unlock insights in of itself. So next, look into cultural dimensions and shifts that might be impacting your target consumer. So I know I stepped out kind of a list, but this is kind of one of the first asterisks. This needs to start before you get the brief. If I could leave everyone, I will, with one point today, it would be that you should start doing this now. You need, if you are interested in planning, that is, you kind of need to be curious. Like it's a pretty key attribute that really needs to be there if you want to be a planner. So you need to be involved in the world and be taking in what's going on. You couldn't just import an alien who's never been on this earth and put them in front of a brief and get them to understand who they need to sell it to and how, because everything exists in a cultural context. And you really just need to sort of try to be on top of this as much as you can. It's good practice anyway. If you're going to work in anything, I think in the creative industry or any other industry, it's nice to be involved in the world. But how you could do that, sort of events, so pop-ups, exhibitions, free lectures, comedy shows, I purposely put there, which sounds a bit random, but comedians are some of the most insightful people that you'll see. So often observational humor, and yeah, they often have really interesting gems. So media, film and TV, what's new on Netflix, what's trending, games, news, lifestyle, satire. So the Batuta Advocate or the Onion, they're always just insights, like they're cultural insight, cultural insight, cultural insight. That's basically what they're pumping out, and they might be funny, but they are insights. Podcasts. So again, like, I mentioned this at the start in terms of the ones I was interested in, but there are so many, and there are so many niche ones. It's kind of amazing to be living in a time where there's a product that has such high, such high exposure, but it's so, the barriers to entry are so low for the people producing them that there's really anything that you might want out there, which is pretty amazing. And just to see what's trending is also a really good key around what's happening in society. In the same way that satire is, can seem silly, but is really meaningful, memes kind of do the same thing. So meme trends and random things that are being set out there that are kind of gaining traction are a really nice indicator to what tension society is feeling as well. And then finally, trends. So progressive lifestyle publications often talk about something, before it happens, or something that's starting to gain traction. There are specific companies that do this, like that's all they do. So JWT isn't one of them. That's obviously an advertising firm as well, but they do trend tracking really well. They do the JWT 100 every year, which is awesome. LSN, Cassandra Daily, etc. There are lists out there. See what's happening in other countries who might be leading the category. So there are some categories where Australia leads, but there are others where they don't. So it's worth seeing what's happening in those more progressive locations, because there can be some clues there as well. And then finally, look at everything else and try to spot them for yourself. I actually, at BWM, a big part of my job this year has been running a thing called The Current, which we started in January, that is exactly a trend tracking sort of platform. Myself and a few other colleagues every week look at what's going on the internet and try to group them into trends, and then we send it out as an EDM. It's available to the public if anyone wants to see it. And so, it's kind of at the start, I was pretty intimidated, but with the help of a few people as well, you do start to notice trends when you're kind of looking for them. Cool. So next, talk to your audience. My point here, though, is use your other product cultural category research first to prepare, because people's time is precious, and it's worth showing them that you respect it by doing the preparation first. It also means that you'll be getting a more meaningful response out of them. If you've already had some thoughts around what the category is doing, what your product means, what your brand means, and you can test those hypotheses without leading the witness, you'll just end up in a much richer place. So kind of, I would just say have some hypotheses and go in there with them so that you can test them, rather than going in and starting from scratch and wasting both of your time. So on that, and again, I worked in research, so I just have a few thoughts around this, but they're helpful, I think, to the whole experience as well. So take advantage of your own experience, but don't overplay it. Recognize your bias. So when searching for the consumer insight, talking to people, but also just thinking about yourself and your own experience, use your advantage to your experience, to your advantage, but for sure, but recognize your own bias. And this is quite hard in advertising. There tends to be a certain type of person that works in advertising. So I think this is something that we all struggle with, and we try to step outside of our shell as much as we can, because just because you don't like something, or just because you love it, or you think it's funny, doesn't mean that everyone will. Use your lack of knowledge to your advantage. So it's quite good to sort of play really dumb. So not super dumb, but having asked lots of people questions about lots of random things in the past, they won't necessarily tell you all the little bits that are super useful just off the top of their head. But if you sort of say to them, can you explain it to me? I know nothing about this. They'll take you on a much more nuanced journey a lot of the time. And finally, recognize their bias, and don't let any one answer derail or write your insight. So in terms of recognizing their bias, this can be super important depending on the category as well. So for cars, for example, I've seen groups where it's one of the most expensive things you can buy. So when someone has already bought the car, they don't want to learn that it's a bad car, and they will often do anything to defend it, unless you put the specs up in front of them and it doesn't match up. So they're, even unknown to their self, are trying to post-rationalize their purchasing decision. So yeah, it's just kind of recognizing that they might have that bias and not letting it influence. And also sometimes they'll just hate, I've gone to ask someone about yogurt and they just hated yogurt, which they definitely shouldn't have been picked to ask. But yeah, certain things will completely derail the whole thing if you let it, but there's still other things you can get out of it. That said, don't let one person's comment write your whole insight or the whole sort of territory. It might be the starting point of that, but you need to test it, and you need to kind of pressure test it with other research as well. So some basics. So state your neutral position. Just say, I don't care if, what you think about this product. I, have no skin in the game. It's more useful to me if you just tell me everything truthfully, because people will want to naturally sort of make you feel good and tell you that the product's great. Like not everyone. Some people just want to watch the world burn, but most people will just naturally want to make you happy, and they think by telling you the thing is good, you'll be happy. So compare it to others to find the competitive edge. Sometimes if you ask people about Toyota, they won't tell you much. But if you say, oh, how would it compare to Honda, or how would it compare to Suzuki, you'll learn a lot more. Use open-ended questions. So don't lead the witness. Try to mix up the why. So at the end of each, when you're not getting much out of them, try not to just say why. Try to think about how your words are structured. Use silence. People will fill it. There's obviously a limit to this, but normally speaking, if someone's a bit cagey and they won't say much, if you are asking the right questions, sometimes all you need to do is just give them a moment. People's brains also just take different amount of time to process things, so people will sort of naturally try to fill it. Best practice, think of the order of your questions and how they might help or hinder each other. So you kind of normally, when we were doing consumer research, you kind of think of it as a bit of a funnel. So you want to start broad and then get down into the nitty gritty. And I mean that in a couple of ways. Certain things can be quite personal. I did a whole project around dating and dating programs. So I was asking some pretty personal questions about their own dating life and stuff. And that one was definitely one where you really want to start general and then get into the traumatic relationship experience last, for example, just because you have sort of formed that connection, but also in a much more sort of simple fashion, you don't want to mention that you're working for Toyota at the start and then the whole time they're thinking about Toyota and they're peppering that throughout the whole set of their answers. Get creative, so different strokes for different folks. So just think of how different your brain processes something to your partners, to your friends, to your parents, and just try to make sure there's a mix of activities to sort of counter that. And to that point, projective techniques can work really well. So when you ask someone, what do you do for work? They might give you a really boring, the answer that you've come up with 1,000 times to answer that question at, a dinner party or whatever. But when you ask them, what would your son say you do for work? You'll get a really nice, interesting insight into that dynamic and into the way they think others perceive them, for example. So I'm at the point where you sort of think you're going to get to the end. But at this point, I would just say the journey is not linear. So each of these sort of cultural consumer product category, all this research and, questions you're asking and everything, they don't necessarily go in a structured manner. So you might have this category in observation, do desk research to find the data, go to the supermarket, realize something that you thought was true isn't true, go back to the desk research, look at the consumer responses you didn't think were relevant the first time when you had a hunch about something else, but now seem a lot more relevant. If you're lucky enough, you can hopefully talk to a consumer again. But yeah, it's kind of, there is no linear process, and you've got to kind of just trust in that and in the process, and know that kind of when you get there, you'll feel it. But it is a bit of a puzzle, and not in a bad way. It's just that you can't know that you should have been looking for something at the supermarket if you hadn't heard that thing from that consumer at that point in time. So it really is a back and forth. So how do you know when you've arrived? So on the left, it's not actually that indicative of what I mean, but basically it's a nod to the fact that my colleague at work said that it's kind of a slight head tilt moment when you tell someone, or when you think of the insight, it's kind of like a really slight surprise head tilt. Oh, like, how did I not think of that before? And like, that's such a sort of fundamental truth that really helps shed new light on this problem, and helps unlock it, that it's kind of a little small aha moment. But a few things that sort of help. So there will be more than one answer. So when you write a creative brief, you're delivering one answer out of many, many possible answers. Sometimes only a few, sometimes it's harder than others, but a lot of the time it'll be one answer, not the only one. So you've just got to ask yourself, does it feel true? Does it feel interesting? It's also got to excite the creative team. Does it feel new? And does it feel ownable? It doesn't have to do all of those things, the big tick, but it should be doing a couple of them. A couple of examples on the sort of new and the ownable. So for new, I don't know if you saw it, I've actually got one image of it, but for the Super Bowl this year, the Cheetos brand, Cheetos did an ad where they had sort of MC Hammer, you can't touch this. And basically it was a man with Cheeto dust on his fingers being like, oh, I can't help, or I can't do all these things that people are asking me to do in my busy life. So the insight that was kind of came from was around sort of this busy, efficiency driven world, which is one of the most common insights at the moment, I would say. But what they did is they sort of combined it with a product edge of being the Cheeto dust that you wouldn't normally think is potentially a good thing, but they combined it and said, look, Cheeto dust helps you kind of take a break and step out of that efficiency driven world for a second. So it wasn't an entirely new sort of consumer thought, but when you paired it with that edge, it became new. And then for ownable, again, so I was lucky enough to work on Snickers and the Hungarythm and that kind of thing. So they have, you know, the You're Not You and You're Hungry platform, which fundamentally isn't more true of Snickers than a lot of different brands. Like, it might be a very filling chocolate bar, but there are other filling chocolate bars. You could talk about being full and being hangry, you know, for lots of brands, but they were the ones that did it first. So it was ownable. They also have made it more ownable over time by reinforcing that in really, you know, clever, specific ways that feel very Snickers and feel very true of the brand. Sleep on it, find the evidence, and test it on others. So look around, you need to pressure test it. You need to, I'm not saying, you know, back it up with evidence and, you know, back sort of logic it, but there should be enough out there that, you know, if you've been searching for it and you can't find it, it's not there. But yeah, hopefully there will be. Test it on others, see if you get that same like aha moment. Normally planners, because people in the real world might not care. And yeah, just sleep on it. Sometimes you just need to sort of think about it for a bit to make sure it feels new and interesting and ownable and true. And then finally, back yourself. As I said, there are multiple answers that this could be. And so you need to sort of back yourself and go into that room. You know, internally, it can even be, before you even get to the client, the internal debate can be pretty fierce. So back yourself, and the way you can back yourself is by proving that you've done all these research. You've thought about these different paths and you've crossed them off for X and Y reason. And just, yeah, back yourself with all the clever research you've done to build a really compelling story. At the same time, you should be open to others, because working in a creative agency is hopefully a really collaborative process, and there will be people that inject ideas, and the insight might not come from you. You might have someone else say it in the room who's, you know, a creative or a suit or anything like that. So yeah, you need to sort of back yourself and believe in it, but be open to others sort of potentially shifting and slightly tweaking that idea. 2 thoughts to leave with you, as mentioned earlier: culture. So that's something that you can start anytime. Yeah, as mentioned, I think it's good practice anyway to be sort of involved in the world. But also a benefit of, if you are sort of in still, you know, uni, you might be in a sort of younger demographic. And you can do this, you can be tapped into culture at any age, of course, but it does seem to feel like it's more easy. You've got less responsibilities a lot of the time. You're also naturally tapped into a lot of the events, a lot of the things that make culture really in your face if you're looking for it. So yeah, I'll just start doing that, start listening and reading and tapping into as much as you can. And then secondly, practice. So it can be a really probably dorky thing to say, but fun exercise to look at ads on the internet, look at ads and work backwards and try to figure out what their sort of insight was, their get who to buy. There are other structures you can do. This I've stolen from a planner called Julian Cole, who's also an Australian planner who's done pretty well. And he's got a whole list of 2020 Super Bowl ads, and they didn't work on them, but they've worked backwards to kind of work out how they might have got there. And it's just an interesting thought to say, how'd you get to that insight? It might make it seem easier than it was. It will make it seem easier than it was, but it's still a really good way to sort of think about insights more and think about how you might get there. That's it.
Oh, look, thank you very much, Zara. That's amazing. That's really, really interesting journey and very practical. And there's a lot of interesting information I think the students can take away from this presentation. Can I just ask you to stop sharing the screen?
Yes. Oh, I see. I was just having a look. Oh, I've done it wrong.
There we go. Great. And students that are with us, who remain with us, can I ask you to turn your cameras on, please? So you can, and if you have a question, you can ask Zara directly, or you can put your put a message up in chat. It's up to you. So the floor is open to you guys. That's students. I mean, I've got questions, but I want you to ask questions.
You could kick us off.
Actually, can I just quickly ask a question? Because I think we talked about it in the run up, and that's about. Sorry, we've got a question coming in actually, so I'll come back to my question if we've got time. Oh, I don't have any questions. Oh, there we go. I just wanted to ask about your view on selling in the pandemic or post-pandemic, and where insights, where the planner's role is today, because you highlighted a really interesting point. Yeah. And that was before everyone joined us, and I'm wondering if you could share that with everyone.
Oh, so I was just saying at the start, so with Toyota, we work on a lot of retail. Yeah, they're probably the most noisy car brand in the market, but they needed to amend stuff and chop and change things a lot. And as is normal process at the end of each of their retail campaigns, it's mainly my job to sort of evaluate what happened and how the audience reacted and why, and what are some learnings we can come up with for next time. But the interesting thing was when we went to do that for the last 3 months, it was just, I literally put, it's funny, I had an asterisk in this as well, but we literally put a giant asterisk at the start of the presentation to say, we've tried our best to come up with learnings, but we're in a completely new, unprecedented time, but this also won't necessarily happen again. So any of these learnings, we've tried to make them robust and tried to make them mean something in the general world, but reality, they might not be that useful into the future because we're going to be living in a totally different world. And even if we have to go into lockdown for the second or third or fourth or fifth time, people's attitudes and behaviors are going to be different by that time. So yeah, in terms of it's a big but in terms of selling post-pandemic, I don't know. I think it really depends on the industry. I think there are industries that will do really well out of the sort of excitement of actually being able to buy again. I think our government, don't want to get political, but has done actually a really good job in keeping people, a lot of people anyway, financially stable. We're obviously going into a recession, but cars might be a tricky one, for example. But again, within cars, Toyota saw one of their most successful months in the last few years in June or July, sorry. So it really depends. They were lucky because their whole thing is around trust and reliability. So in a pandemic, it's quite like a no-brainer in terms of what kind of things you might lean towards. So yeah, I don't know. It really does depend on the category. Like home improvement, for example, like there's kind of two schools of thought that people will either become quite insular and work on things like home improvement and the sort of house proud stuff and quiet, slower living, all that stuff that the pandemic has shown us is so nice and that we normally miss out on. But then there's also this whole thing that I've heard called revenge spending, which is like, well, I want to live life the hardest and party as much as I can and spend as much money as I can and do all the things that were taken away from me so quickly. So I think, honestly, I know it's a bad answer, but I think I think there's value in sort of both of those. Also, not all consumers are the same. So there'll be a mix of people doing both those things. But I think it's really differentiated by the category, the brand, and the person, unfortunately.
So I haven't heard of that new, was it the revenge spender? Is that what you
Yeah,
said?
the revenge spending.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah. No, it was something crazy. Like, I think Hermes opened for the first day in a couple of months, near the start of this year, and they had one of their biggest days that they've ever had. So yeah, it's kind of a weird, you wouldn't necessarily expect it, but then yeah, people maybe in that upper echelon of society who are buying those brands weren't as impacted and, were like, finally, normally doing shop, I can shop again. I don't know. But yeah, it is going to be really interesting to see what happens. And I think, yeah, you can get some clues from other countries for sure, because that's kind of the good thing about the pandemic is you can have a look at different countries who are in different positions, and yeah, they're not all acting the same. So it's really dependent. But yeah.
Students, do you have any questions? You can just put up, you can talk. No. They're very confident. I love the confidence. Nicholas and John, do you have any questions from University of Queensland, Western Sydney?
No, not as well. Only just thinking around the. Hi, Zara. How are you?
Hi. Good. Thanks. How are you?
That's good. Look, well, only thinking around obviously the COVID situation, just with the research. So obviously that would be throwing up some challenges, I would imagine, about how are you going about your research?
Yeah, well, luckily, actually, when I left the lab, to be honest, a big part of why I wanted to get into planning was because spending my nights until 11 at night, multiple days a week wasn't for me, asking people questions. But so actually, I don't do too much of that compared to then, but there are ways to do it. I think the kind of benefit of people all being locked down is, they've got a lot more spare time in their hands. Like I went to donate blood the other week, and their donations have gone up massively throughout this time. So in terms of getting a good mix of people to answer consumer research questions, if you can do it from afar, it can be really valuable. And there's different types of research. Like obviously, a research group can work really well and in a different way than sort of one-on-one interactions, but at the same time, sometimes there's problems associated with that you wouldn't have online, like someone just completely dominating a group situation, where you have to be more structured and things like that. So from what I've heard in like my friends who are still working in research, again, depending on the category, there's been some massive pauses from some brands, but other brands are still sort of taking it as a time to do some of that research that they might have been putting off when other things were too busy. But I think you can do a lot online, and just watching people's reactions. I think it's valuable to have video when you can, and that kind of thing for those cues. But yeah, in terms of witnessing their consumer journey and all that stuff, I think COVID again makes it quite difficult because I don't know, there's so many mitigating factors. Like I find it personally, random aside, but when I try to go for runs, which I normally do, I'm finding it so much harder. So it's like, well, if you go and watch someone do their supermarket shop, is it going to be that valuable? There's probably issues that you have to kind of sort out and read in between the lines, which any good researcher is good at reading between the lines anyway. But yeah, there's a lot of other noise coming in that's going to be affecting that. So I imagine it's quite difficult. But luckily, the campaigns I'm on at the moment, we haven't done research for. So at BWM, I probably do research once every 3 or 4 months, and I'll just go and sit in the room and watch the sort of groups and that kind of thing, unless we've kind of said we should do more research, and then I might go out and talk to experts and ring friends and that kind of thing, sort of ad hoc. But yeah, so that was kind of a roundabout answer.
Yeah, actually interesting. What you bring up is, sorry, John, go.
No, sorry, that's fine. That was great. Thanks, Sarah.
All right.
It's interesting because what you're saying is there's a lack of clarity. So a lack of consumer clarity. Is that what you're sort of trying to suggest?
Yeah. I think a lot of the research companies are pivoting to, I know the lab have done some really great presentations in just, making it very COVID specific. Like, I think there might be some big gaps that have been left by companies turning off their research at the moment. But they're just kind of, because it is like, as much as it's horrible and I wish it had never happened, it's fascinating, all the different elements that have come out from a consumer perspective. And that thing I said I work on at BWM, the sort of trend tracking thing, when this started, I was like, well, this is awkward. We were going to do this trend tracking thing. And now what do we do? Because all of the news is about COVID. But actually, there are so many elements, as everyone will have seen, to COVID and what that means for education, what it means for relationships, what it means for everything, that I think have been some really fascinating outcomes. And hopefully not too depressingly, you're going to see that continue to affect consumers for probably a long time. And there might be some positives, like obviously everyone just talks about when, in Victoria anyway, when we're allowed to go back out into the real world, like hopefully we really appreciate all the things we get to do more, and maybe people won't be so annoyed to see a big billboard out on their way to work because they're excited to be actually going to work. So
that's interesting. That's interesting. So you're talking about a different view of advertising. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's probably a stretch, but still.
Very positive. Nicholas, anything from the University of Queensland or any thoughts?
Well, I'm conscious of time, but I did have a question. It was more related about the process of coming up with the insight. I just actually was discussing with one of the groups today that they often go to a lot of the facts and the understanding of the consumer target. But what's common about students is that they don't understand that the insight is what should motivate the consumer to take the action. And what they have difficulties in a lot of the time is that they don't know how to relate the insight to that specific problem that you're facing. So I think when you talked about the tension, I guess my question is, how do you go about making sure that you don't go off track and stick with that problem to create the right tension? Because it's very easy to get lost in that, like you said, the process of coming up with insight is not a straightforward one. It's a spiraling wheel, and it's kind of confusing. So you have to get clarity amongst all that complexity.
Yeah.
So do you have a specific process or
if I had an answer for that, I would be very happy. But no, I think a lot of the time, and again, it's that kind of conundrum, as if you want to be a planner, as I said, you're probably hopefully a curious person anyway, so I'll end up in an Atlantic article about something completely off topic because it's interesting, like it's a problem, it's what happens. But at the same time, the beauty of it is that it might be useful for your next thing or whatever. But that said, it's just kind of, I think what's really useful is always trying to think about, if you find yourself in that mode where you're not sort of thinking of useful things, it's kind of thinking about the brand and thinking about their overarching purpose. So that can be really useful. Like L'Oreal, You're Worth It, about women's, empowerment and feeling confident in themselves and all that stuff. You kind of can, I think it takes practice, but you can kind of just know that what you're looking at right now is never ever going to attach to that, or just is so far away from where you started, and thinking also about the unique selling point and the key selling point, like thinking about the benefits that those key selling points and unique selling points allow consumers, is pretty handy in working out. So what are the feelings and what are the thoughts that make that key selling point cut through for consumers? And if the stuff you're looking at has nothing to do with trust or has nothing to do with confidence or whatever it is, you can kind of start to think, hey, I'm not thinking about the consumer need right here, right now, or why they might be doing what they do and thinking how they think. I don't know. It's kind of practice, but I do think thinking about the key selling point and just trying to remind yourself of the client objectives can help you and can ground you. But again, some of the best creative comes from things that you're like, wow, I wouldn't have thought to put those two things together. But yeah, I think it does take practice, but there are some ways you can kind of try to ground yourself. Sorry, that's probably not that good answer.
Zara, can I just fit in one final question, because we're actually over time, and it's just from Renee, who's a student. And it's an interesting question. So she, and I don't know if you can see it in your chat. So she says, how do you go about presenting research and insights to a client that proves their brief wrong? And in brackets, our brief has target define, objective define, etc. But Q&A with the client yesterday undermined it.
I think there's a benefit to knowing your client really well and having worked with them before. Like, so much of advertising is gaining that trust so that you can poke holes in their brief. But I think it's just proving your case really well. If you are able to convince them with sort of a story that takes into account the unique selling point, the brand, the heritage, the category, all that stuff that ladders into a really unique, you know, beautiful territory or thought that you have landed on, you'd be hard pressed to find a client who, you know, isn't a little bit bought in, hopefully. So it's kind of, it's just kind of making sure your story is really robust and also having an argument for why they're wrong. Like, without, you know, you need to do it in a nice way, but often it's kind of saying, well, if you try to talk to this market who don't care about aesthetics with this car that is specifically targeting aesthetics, you're not going to win. So yeah,
so you got to be brave in that sense.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You do. And I think, I mean, I'd say that for planning general, you're often sitting in a room of people that are much smarter than you, much more experienced or whatever. So it's, you kind of need to have that. You kind of have to get accustomed to being wrong or being rejected and all that stuff. It can be kind of upsetting, but at the same time, you've got to play that game if you kind of want to ever get anywhere, I think, in planning.
Look, and with that, and that was a wonderful answer to a great question at the end. Thank you, Renee. Thank you. And I'd like to call the end of the session, really, because we're over time. And I think that's been a magnificent and insightful presentation. Sorry, I had to get that in.
Well done, David.
Look, it's been wonderful to have you, Zara, and I really appreciate your time. I know you're very busy, and it's a complex world at the moment in agency land, but BWM Dentsu do some wonderful work, and I'm always a big fan of the agency in Melbourne.
Awesome.
And look, so thank you everyone for joining us today, and for all those students who couldn't make it today. This recording is available on our virtual cafe.